When I first started, there were 9 reporters. I am now all of those people.
Our guest today is Evan Brandt. He is the last local newspaper reporter living in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. A hedge fund bought out his newspaper company a few years ago, gutted everything, cut the staff, there were layoffs. They even sold the office building where the employees would work out of. Now his home attic is his office.
People have the idea that there's sort of this anonymous behemoth that's the giant newspaper, and really it's just a few people putting out a daily miracle.
A daily miracle that he helps to make happen, but he's not thrilled about it. In fact, he had a question for that president of the hedge fund that gutted his newspaper company, so he went to find him and ask. The president met with congressional leaders. Doctors will start implanting the devices. And he heard that warning from the Coast Guard tonight. For now, we're live in Orlando. For now, we're live in Dallas. We're live in Boston tonight. Caitlin McCulley, 7 News 19. I'm Caitlin McCulley. I left my job as a TV news reporter in a pandemic to try to find a better way to share stories that matter, no BS. Thanks for listening to Outlet Podcast. You can download new episodes each week. Here's Evan Brandt. You are the last local newspaper reporter living in Pottstown, Pennsylvania for the Mercury. Is that right?
Mostly. I am the last one living in Pottstown, and I am the only municipal reporter. We have 3 sports reporters. We have a courts reporter in Montgomery County where Pottstown is located, but he also writes for other papers. When you're part of a chain in the region, it gets a little tricky saying you're the last one. Right. But I'm definitely the last one living here. So
last one living in Pottstown.
Yes.
So you've been working at the Mercury since 1997. Since then, your paper has had a few different owners and then was bought out by a hedge fund, which drained your paper of resources, a story that's pretty common in news operations across the country, unfortunately. And now with the
sadly common, yes.
With the pandemic, there are even more layoffs and pay reductions. So I wanted to talk with you about the news business. A lot of people can write books on the topic, can conduct studies, talk about what needs to happen to save journalism. That's all great, but you're living it. And I wanted to give people listening to this podcast an opportunity to get to know you and your day-to-day in Pottstown.
So I'm a member of the union, and as such, we have a contract with the company. Not all of the media newspapers in Pennsylvania are union. Some are, some aren't. And I'm supposed to work 7.5 hours a day. I generally work 10 to 12 hours a day, for which I am paid 7.5 hours. I used to be paid overtime, but that went away a long time ago and now needs to be pre-authorized. But when you're in the news business, and if a house is burning down, or if you suddenly become aware of a story that's important when you've already worked 7 hours and 15 minutes, you can't always get authorization to press on. So generally speaking, you just press on, and that's the way it shakes out. When I first started at the Mercury, there were 9 reporters in the newsroom, all had different beats. There are geographic beats, and you're a general assignment reporter for all of those things, except for police. We had a dedicated police reporter because we were very big on police and spot news. I am now all of those people. And so on any given night, I consider it very important and the primary mission of my beat to cover municipal news, because that is the stuff that affects people the most. It affects their pocketbook. It affects, what's going to happen with their kids at school. It affects whether or not their road's going to be paved. It's not the world's most exciting stuff, but I think it's the most important stuff. And often enough, people don't get excited about it until it's their road or their kid or their tax bill. So now, as a result of the fact that we cover parts of 3 counties, roughly, 25, 30 different municipalities. At election time, it's closer to 50. So on any given night of the week, I have 3 to 4 meetings that I could attend. And so you need to do a little bit of agenda whispering to try and tease out which one's likely to have the most important news, because obviously you don't know ahead of time. So, I mean, you could give me 20 reporters and I could employ them all here in the newsroom, well, in my attic. We don't have a newsroom anymore. I could find employment for all of them. And because you're always missing something. But now we're missing so many things. It's dispiriting, and I don't think it's really the public service that it should be.
How do you decide what's important?
Well, the fact that I've been here for more than 20 years gives me some insight into what's important, and that's one of the things that's being lost in local news, and it's hard to quantify. So it's value. It's what I call a Joni Mitchell moment. You don't know what you had till it's gone, and so that institutional memory and history with the various people involved. For example, I know if a developer is going to be on the agenda of a particular township meeting and it's a big 500 unit project and it's been going for a long time and a lot of people are interested in what's going to happen with it, that's a big subject. But if you just stepped in off the street and looked at something that said Saratoga Green on the agenda, you might think it was about a golf green, and not know. So having that background is extremely helpful. But I miss things all the time because, frankly, things come up that aren't on the agenda, which is the only real guide you have, unless you have a tip that someone says, the superintendent's going to resign at tonight's school board meeting. You should be sure to be there. So it's really best guess, and sometimes as an exercise in populism, I actually post all the agendas on my Twitter account and ask people which one do you think I should attend, and see what the readers think about that. They usually guess wrong.
They usually guess wrong?
Yes, because they usually guess based on self-interest.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. This idea, the democratization of news, and how everybody is a journalist these days. That's what proponents of that theory would say, with iPhones and with the ability to broadcast online to anyone and everyone. The gatekeeper aspect of journalists, that's kind of out the window.
It's not as prevalent as it used to be. It doesn't mean that it isn't as necessary as it used to be. Mm-hmm. But social media has enabled sort of an end run around that. And there are aspects of the gatekeeper function that could be criticized, and you could say that the media wasn't doing it well, or it's where its bias showed, and those are all valid arguments. But in an era of fake news, in an era of people believing that there's voter fraud when there's no evidence of it, I don't think I need to talk too long to give you the evidence of what happens when there isn't a gatekeeper, when someone isn't actually validating things that get broadcast out to hundreds, thousands, millions of people. You sort of get information chaos. And what's also happening in the country as a result of that, I fear, is a loss of what I call media literacy. People, particularly younger generations who never grew up with network news and so weren't used to the idea that everyone went to the same three places to get their information, and the information was considered credible, whether or not they liked it, whether or not they thought there was a spin to it. It was, few argued with the fact that it was in all likelihood true. But this younger generation, you see a YouTube video, you have a desk, you have a background, it looks just like a newscast. And a lot of people, I think, don't recognize that the people who are sometimes speaking on those things have made no effort whatsoever to check the authenticity of what they're telling you. And they get accepted with the same level of truthfulness, with the same level of belief as someone who has spent hours and hours trying to figure out if something's true or not. So the loss of the gatekeeper, I think we're seeing the impact now in the fact that, almost half the country thinks there was voter fraud.
Mm-hmm. We have these opportunities for everybody to post what they think and what they think is true. Is there a way that you see that we could go back to the way it used to be? You hear a lot of times where, people will say, oh, I wish we could go back to the Cronkite era, or I wish journalists would just report just the facts. I don't know that there's a way to go back without thinking really creatively on how we evolve. What do you think?
There isn't. The horse is out of the barn on that one, and you can't tell people they need to stop watching the things that that warm their confirmation bias. What's really necessary, I think, uh, and this has a little bit of self-interest in it, is when you strengthen local news. If you look at Pew surveys now, you'll see that local news, as diminished as it is, remains the thing that people trust the most. It also improves their critical thinking skills in terms of what they believe and what they don't, and I think it's because they can verify it. If you're reporting that a school superintendent has resigned, as I just did today on my day off, then they're going to find out that's true soon enough, and so it's easy to verify that sort of thing can be done. The national and local news is the feeder for what people are going to believe. And so once you get up to the national level, you sort of have to take it on faith, and that faith has been diminished. And I find people generally have a hard time accepting things on a conceptual basis until they have a personal experience. Debates about how deadly or how dangerous COVID-19 is are a good example. There are lots of folks who say, it's not that dangerous, you're ruining my life, and then your daughter gets it, and suddenly it becomes very real, and you say, gosh, this really was dangerous. I wish I had believed the people who were telling me it was dangerous all this time. And so that the common the common foundation for the information that you need to know and that's relevant that local news provides also happened on a national level until those outlets got undermined. Some of it is their own fault. Certainly, they're not perfect, but I don't think that what we've come up with in the alternative is really a service to the country at all.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned a few times that you're covering the work of 9 people potentially. You said you could even fill it with 20 people if you had them. So you're doing this on your off time a lot of the days. You're not getting paid for the work that you're doing. Why do you continue to do it?
I've said once or twice before that I see journalism, and particularly local journalism, as a calling. It's important for people to remember that it's a public service. It's like being a firefighter or a police officer. My life is much less rarely in danger than either of those people, but it's been known to happen. I've been in a few tight spots. But because the primary function of journalism, the reason that there's a First Amendment, is to be a watchdog on government. Unlike fire and police, it can't be funded by the government. People don't think about the funding for that because they just pay their taxes and they get fire protection and they get police protection, but you can't fund journalism that way. And so as a result of that, people have to pay for it. And once its credibility and its usefulness began to be undermined, and of course, as the price went up, as hedge fund folks tried to extract as much profit from it as they can with little interest in it being sustainable, that became a more difficult choice for people to make. And so I really think that what needs to happen is we need to find a different kind of model to make sure that the function still happens. I mean, I'm an old geezer. I grew up with newspapers, ink in my blood, all of that stuff. But if newspapers went away and local journalism remained, I'd be perfectly happy with that. It doesn't matter to me what the format or the template is. What's important is that the function remains.
You brought up the hedge fund, and I'm sure over your years, you've had many opportunities to confront people as parts of stories and ask difficult questions. You actually visited the home of the president of the hedge fund that bought out your newspaper. What was that like, and what did you ask?
Well, we didn't actually speak. My father and my stepmother live on Long Island, and I had just read an article in the New Republic by a reporter that the Guild is paying. Julie Reynolds, who's doing amazing investigative work on Alden Global Capital, which is the name of the hedge fund that owns us and many other newspapers across the country. And I had just read a piece about Heath Freeman, the president of the company, expanding his $1 million beach house out in Montauk, which isn't that far from where my father lives. And so I thought, let's do the social media thing. I'll make a sign, I'll stand in his driveway, we'll put it on Twitter, everyone will clap. Maybe it'll move something. We were in the middle of contract negotiations at the time. So it all sort of happened bit by bit. It wasn't a plan. So I'm standing in the driveway, and a car pulls out, and it's Mr. Freeman's wife, and she says, "Can I help you?" And I thought, "Sure. Is your husband home?" And she was looking at a T-shirt I was wearing that said "News Matters," and I was holding a sign that said "Invest in us or sell us." And she decided that her husband wasn't home. However, I could hear Dave Matthews playing from the back deck that overlooks Lake Montauk, and I thought, yeah, he's home. No one leaves the stereo running when no one's home. And so I decided, I knock on doors all the time and ask people questions point blank. This isn't really any different. So I knocked on the door. The person I assumed to be the housekeeper let me in. He was there at the top of the stairs. She said, "This man wants to talk to you." He just shook his head, and out the door I went. So that's as far as it went. I'm afraid there was no cinematic confrontation.
What question were you going to ask him?
I did have to think about that as I was walking up from the driveway, and the question that I settled on was, what value do you place on local news as the owner of one of its sources? And I didn't want the answer to that to be a monetary value. I wanted to see if I could get him to understand that the value to society, that the value to democracy is much greater than what he sees on the balance sheet. But I didn't really have that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So what did you walk away thinking from that interaction, or non-interaction, I guess?
That I wasn't surprised that he had declined to speak with me, because at that point he hadn't spoken with anyone. It wasn't until 2 years later, I think, that the Washington Post finally got an interview with him. But I wasn't surprised he didn't want to speak with me, but I was kind of surprised that I'd gotten as far as I had. There are newspaper companies, and there are companies that own newspapers. Alden doesn't care what's in the paper. They could care less, unless you're writing about them, and then they'll fire you. But
you haven't been fired.
No, and that's why I keep mentioning that I'm in a union, because there is a certain element of protection that you get from being in a union, and certainly when you're talking about working conditions and you're talking about contracts and pay, those are all things that they could try to fire me, and someday they may, but the union would put up a fight, and I don't think they want to pay the lawyer. That's what I was thinking.
Okay. Do you think that hedge fund presidents and high-ranking officials, do you think that they are particularly evil people out to get journalists and attack democracy? Or do you think they don't realize it, or simply don't care as much?
It's not their primary function. So I don't think they're evil. I'm not crazy about what they're doing and the impacts that they're having, but I don't think anyone grew a paper thin mustache, rubbed their hands together, and said, "Let's see if we can destroy local journalism today." For a long time, America had newspaper companies. There were local publishers. There were people who were responsive and responsible to the community. And they had a function beyond just making a profit. In the 80s, when national chains began taking up and Wall Street took an interest and realized the profit margins that were available in newspapers, that became the first function. And we shouldn't be surprised that that became the first function. That's what they do. It's Wall Street. They're about making profit. And so, if we're upset that we're being eaten by hedge fund sharks, my answer is stop swimming with sharks. We need a different kind of ownership. And that's why I keep talking about trying to find a different model for local journalism. It's also something that the News Guild, which I am a member of, has also begun to take up very actively. There are any number of different models out there that work on a small scale. And, so hedge funds are not newspaper companies. They're companies that own newspapers.
Mhm.
Alden Global Capital also owns a pharmacy chain, which they drove into bankruptcy. They owned a shoe store chain, which they drove into bankruptcy. Other hedge funds owned Toys R Us, which they drove into bankruptcy. The the predatory nature of vulture capitalism is not sustainability. It's maximum profit for as long as you can maintain it, and once you're done, you throw the corpse away and you move on to the next victim. So I'm not surprised that this is happening. I'm sad about it, but I don't I it's why they exist.
Mhm. And you mentioned other models, potential models for funding journalism. That's the big question that everyone's trying to figure out, and there
Mm-hmm.
have been a lot of experimentation, which I think is great. We're not going to figure it out until a lot of people experiment and see what works and what doesn't. Have you seen any examples of models that you like that show promise in your opinion?
I do. First of all, I'm a big believer in nonprofit because the profit motive is so strong that if you're running something on a for-profit basis, it's hard for it not to be your top priority.
Mhm.
Um, and whereas if you're running something on a nonprofit basis, you just have to break even. That's and that's a different kind of mindset. You just need to cover your costs. I first read about that when I was reading years ago when I was reading about the Pointer Institute, which at the time owned the St. Petersburg Times. I think it's called the Tampa Times now. And they struggled, but one of the executives there said, we just need to break even. And I thought, so does the police department. So does the fire department. They just need to break even. No one's trying to make a profit on those public services. Why are we trying to do it in journalism? So I'm a fan of nonprofit, although I realize it's not right for everyone. And there are different, and it's being tried in all different places around the world. I've seen some that work on sort of a PayPal model. For years, I was asking, why can't we have people on the web pay per story? If you pay 5 cents a story or whatever price you think is sustainable and works, what if people just want the local sports? Why do they have to buy the classifieds as well? Why can't they just buy your sports package? So you can differentiate. I mean, they were already newspapers. Local newspapers were they accumulated all kinds of different things. So it was one package for all. But the internet diversified all of that stuff. So people who just want sports just go to sports sites and they don't want to pay for, local news or the classifieds or the comics. So why we think that we can somehow force them to do that is a mystery to me. Um, and I read a series that James Fallows wrote in the Atlantic about visiting different local newspapers and finding ones that worked. Um, Many of them still print. I'm not sure that that's viable. Of course, it depends on the market. That's why when you said it's the question everyone is trying to answer, I don't think it's one question. I think it's 100 questions for each community and what's going to work best for them. So one of the sites, the papers that he profiled was in the Hudson Valley, where I'm actually from originally, in upstate New York, and the folks there had a newspaper that morphed into a news site. They involve the high school kids in reporting some of the stuff from the schools. But the thing that really struck me was they said you can get eyeballs from covering the car crash, from covering the house fire, but you won't get people who want to pay. The people who want to pay to actually get your news and to support you are the people who are interested in the civic functions, the people who are interested in the municipal meetings and the taxes. Is my money being spent wisely? Those are the people who are engaged in civic life, who are willing to pay for what you do. The people who just want to know about the car crash, they want you to tell them and they want to walk away and they're not going to open their wallet. And so I think that's significant, and I think that's a model that bears further exploration.
You mentioned civic engagement, and that's another element to all of this. In your experience, have you seen a decline in people's interest in basic functions of a town or city?
Um, I don't see a decline in the interest. The Joni Mitchell song "Big Yellow Taxi" has a line that I mentioned before. Don't always seem to go. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And so, what I find mostly is people, they're not less interested, but they don't know. But it takes them a while to notice its absence. And then when it isn't there anymore, they'll say, hey, how come that tax increase wasn't in the paper? And you say, well, I was covering 4 other meetings. There wasn't anyone to get to it. I'm trying to get back to it. And they didn't know they needed it until they didn't have it. There's any number of studies which will tell you that people who use local newspapers, but I just prefer to say local news sites, they're more engaged, they vote more, there's more split ticket voting, because they get to know the candidates individually. More people actually run for office. And significantly, you'll also find that it helps keep taxes down. And the reason for that is because when towns and cities take out bonds to pay for big projects, they get their finances analyzed by the bond company that's going to lend them the money. And they found that the bond companies have found that if there isn't a local news site that's keeping a watchdog roll on things, that the possibility for malfeasance, that the possibility for just mismanagement is significantly higher, and they charge a higher interest rate because it increases the risk. And so as a result of that, people who aren't willing to pay for local news end up paying anyway. They pay through higher taxes and a worse run government. So, we're the better deal.
That's really interesting and a great point. What is your relationship like now with your community? Does everyone know you?
Oh yeah, after all these years, it's certainly the case. There was a lady who used to call me Mercury Man because she could never remember my name. Um, whenever I go to the supermarket, I get a lot of "You're that guy," or "Do I know you?" And once they find out who I am, invariably I get a "You know what you should do a story on."
Right. I mean, I think that's a special bond between journalists and the community. And that's also something that's unique about local journalists in particular, is that they're living in the communities where they're reporting. People get to know you, they can learn to trust you. And as you said, they can see the results of whatever you're reporting on and see if it's true or not. Um, that plays into the trust issue in journalism that you mentioned. Um, have you seen that change in the era of fake news? Have you been
Yeah.
harassed at all?
Yeah. I was harassed before fake news was a term.
Mhm.
In fact, I was harassed so long ago that it was anonymous mailed letter campaign that was going
Really?
on. Yeah, that was going around the community in this one town. They didn't like the way I was covering things. I had a suspicion about who it was, but I never found out, and I didn't really pursue it because it sort of felt self-interested to try and report it, and I didn't really know what was going to be accomplished. So we just sort of ignored it until one of whoever was writing it had suggested that on election night, the candidates that they felt I was unfairly favoring would lose, and as a result, that everyone should go by my house and put a tissue in my mailbox because I would be so sad that my candidates had lost. And that felt a little close to home. And so as a result, what I did was after we were done on election night and even a little bit during, I dragooned one of our photographers, back when we had photographers, to be at my house, and we hid in the bushes with a pitcher of margaritas and resolved to jump out and take pictures of anyone who decided to come by and put anything in my mailbox. I'm happy to report that no one dropped by to put anything in my mailbox, but we got pretty tipsy on a pitcher of margaritas. And so it's not new to the internet, but like everything else, what internet and particularly Facebook has done, and Twitter to a similar extent, is just to magnify it, because it gives people the opportunity to do things from a distance, and they don't need to face you. And now that fake news has become a ubiquitous phrase, it's everywhere. So anything that I report that someone doesn't like, that's usually what they say. I have a unfortunately combative tendency to confront those people on Facebook when they address their reporting. And I've often been asked why I do that, because I'm not going to convince them, and my response is always the same. I'm not trying to convince them. It's the hundreds of other people who are watching this discussion who aren't saying anything. if I let my reporting get questioned without responding, then what that person says stands. They already believe that, but I really don't think it's a good idea to let 100 or 300 other people believe it as well, just because I let it go.
How much time does that eat up for you? I imagine
Well,
that's exhausting.
it's exhausting. But I have some rights to the newspapers. I'm one of the administrators for the newspaper's Facebook page. Um, I did have to tone it down after I got a little bit too combative and got a note from my manager that said you can't call people names like that. Um, but generally speaking, I'll try and correct errors. If someone says something about the reporting that's incorrect, I'll generally go on and I always put my initials at the end of it, because the idea that people have the idea that there's sort of this anonymous behemoth that's the giant newspaper, and really it's just a few people putting out a daily miracle.
Mhm. It is a daily miracle, especially these days.
Yeah.
What's next for you? How do you see your future in journalism evolving, or is it?
Well, I'm gonna stick with the steady paycheck and health benefits as long as they're around, because I really can't be a. My dad is a freelance writer, and there were lots of times when there was no money in the bank, and I have enough uncertainty in my life these days. But I also recognize that, as I keep saying, it's not a sustainable model. So at some point, it's probably going to go away. And at that point, I've already begun looking uh, at what comes next. I mean, my value is in local knowledge. The institutional value that I can't take that to Washington D.C. I can't take that to Portland, Oregon. I don't know anyone. I have to start all over again. And and for better or worse, I've become pretty embedded in this community, which is, it's not a rich community. They don't have a lot of things, and the fact that they would lose one more thing because of a corporation, which has already happened to them a couple of times, really doesn't sit well with me. And so I've had conversations with a couple of people about what we would do once it went away, and we'll have to see if it plans out. It's one of the reasons why I have so much interest in other models, because we'd need to find one that works here in Pottstown.
All right, Evan, thank you for talking with me. Is there anything else that you wanted to say that I didn't ask? I always end with that because you never know. I always miss something.
Well, that's always my last question as well. These are 3 front pages from Texas, South Carolina, and California, and you may notice an odd similarity among them, and that's because they're all owned by the same company. And
Hmm.
so that made me a little bit curious. And so I started to. There's a site that's associated with the now closed museum in D.C., and they put up front pages all the time. So I started going through them all across the country and found out that there were more
Oh,
that,
wow.
that I had thought. And obviously, as you can see, California, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, Texas. This is not local news. And so then I found another model with another company, and so it's coming.
Hmm.
34 identical front pages from around the country, and this just sort of goes on and on. So here's a whole bunch from I don't know. This might be McClatchy chain. Um, this is 8 papers in Connecticut. And you got to ask yourself, if local news is trying to be sustainable, how is this different from cable news for a local reader? Now, of course, there were good examples, and so uh, President-elect Biden is from Wilmington, Delaware. So I should certainly hope, as this first page up on the left, that they're going to make a big deal about local boy makes good. It's the ultimate local
Right.
boy makes
Right.
good story. The next one is from Scranton, where he grew up, or at least spent early years, and likes to say he's from. So obviously that also is going to be a kind of thing. And of course, I couldn't resist the tabloids. Um, the Herald, Ready Set Joe, I really liked, which, by the way, is owned by Alden Global Capital. So, um, and this all happens because instead of having a person in each newsroom who is familiar with the various news needs of their community, you have one person who's doing 10 front pages across the country. So obviously there's only going to be time to do one. So they get one design, they'll leave a little hole in the corner for the local story, and everything else will be exactly the same.
Wow.
Now the newspaper that I think really served as the best example of what it should be of local news is this one right here from Casper, Wyoming. And I don't know who owns them. So you can see that that Biden prevailing in the election is obviously a wire story, and it's going to be there. But the story beneath it I thought was excellent, and that is the idea that what does this reflection say about us? What does it say about our community? What have we learned as a result of this? And what they learned was Wyoming has become even more deeply Republican, and it looks at the election results through the lens of the local community, and that's what's supposed to happen. That's what local news is supposed to provide you that you don't get from CNN, and that's what I think we're losing.
Hmm.
So
how did you find these same front pages again? How did you search that?
there was a museum that closed this year in Washington D.C. called the Newseum, and it was dedicated to the news business. And I managed to get there before it closed. But they still have a website, and every day, all of the newspapers that when they do their front pages, that still do it, they send their front pages to the museum, and you can go through by state and just look at every single one. And I do that on a regular basis just to sort of get a sense of particularly on big local stories, big national stories rather, to get a sense of how it's being handled in different places.
Hmm.
And more you really just see it's being handled exactly the same way. And then we wonder why people are walking away from local news. They're not getting anything they can't get by turning on the TV.
Right. It reminds me of what we've seen happen with the big companies that own the local TV stations, like Sinclair,
Exactly.
that came out a while ago, where everybody's saying the same thing, the same scripts.
Right.
Yeah, it's
Now, I will say in the news business, at least as far as Alden Global Capital is concerned, there is very little interference on the editorial side of things. There is not any sort of agenda that is being pushed forward, like you're having with Sinclair. So as a result of that, these are the three Mercury front pages from the era around the election. So obviously, I went out on election night and took pictures of all the big lines and people voting. That's local news. That's not something you're going to get in the New York Times unless there's a 1 in a million chance they happen to be in your town to get the story.
Mhm.
And again, that's the point of there are newspaper companies and there are companies that own newspapers. Alden doesn't care what's in the paper. They could care less, unless you're writing about them, and then they'll fire you. But
You haven't been fired.
no, and that's why I keep mentioning that I'm in a union, because there is a certain element of protection that you get from being in a union, and certainly when you're talking about working conditions and you're talking about contracts and pay, those are all things that they could try to fire me, and someday they may, but the union would put up a fight, and I don't think they want to pay the lawyers.
Mm-hmm. That's a wrap for now. To let me know how this podcast is going in your opinion, or if you have any suggestions on what else you'd like to see, you can leave a review or send me a message on Instagram. See ya in 2021.